Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about a FGC topic that I feel like comes up at least once or twice a year, and I figured it'd be a good idea for me to make a YouTube video about it myself. And that has to do with the topic of how to handle balance patches, and more specifically, whether it's better to nerf characters or buff characters. This has been a topic that comes up very often, and I think one of the reasons for that is a YouTube video that came out from Core Gaming, which I'll link down below. You should definitely watch it. It was a great video. And the video is titled, Why We Should Buff More Than We Nerf. This video basically goes over the exact topic that we're talking about, of whether it's better to buff or nerf characters. However, I want to talk about the topic more in length because I feel like it's a very nuanced topic and there is no one-size-fits-all answer to the subject. When it comes to balancing a fighting game, first of all, I feel like people don't realize how hard it is actually to balance a fighting game, because there's two things that you have to do when you are making a fighting game. You have to balance it, and you also have to make sure that it's fun, and that's where the two things get pretty difficult together. So for me, when the idea comes up that you should only buff characters, I feel like the reason why this is incorrect is that you can very quickly come into a situation where if you're only buffing characters, you're going to make them less fun to fight against very quickly, because the power level of said character is going to end up too high. And on top of that, if all you're doing is buffing a character or buffing system mechanics, whatever it may be, you're also going to run into a situation where that character or system mechanic no longer is retaining its original identity or what it was supposed to be. When characters are created, they're supposed to have a vision of what they are. What are they good at? What are they bad at? And when you start just buffing and buffing and buffing, you kind of lose sight of that, and characters end up not having weaknesses anymore. I think this is really relevant right now in Guilty Gear Strive, because with Season 3, I feel like at this point, the game has very much lost its original identity, which doesn't inherently have to be a bad thing, right? Games can grow and evolve, and that's fine. But when you're doing that, you run the risk of ending up in a situation where things don't feel like they make sense anymore. Currently in Strive with Season 3, due to a lot of system mechanics and character changes that have happened over the years, I feel a lot of characters are converting off way more things than they were ever originally meant to. Characters have way better Oki than they originally ever meant to. Damage is more consistently coming from more situations that it was meant to. That's kind of the risk that you run when all you do is keep upping the power level of the game. And on top of that, you run into a situation where we have a lot of characters that people find just kind of insufferable in Guilty Gear, right? Which, to be fair, is kind of just what the series is about. The series has always been known for being a very high power level series. But there definitely comes a point where it just becomes too much, and you have characters like, you know, Happy Chaos and Ramlethal and Nago running around, and they're just not fun to fight because it doesn't feel like they have weaknesses that they're supposed to, and it feels like they do the things that they're supposed to do a little too well. There isn't enough counterplay to them. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm advocating that we should only nerf things either, because there's obviously a downside with that. The positives to nerfing characters and nerfing system mechanics is that you theoretically make the game less frustrating. When you up the power level, you're adding more chances for things to be unfun to deal with, because those things are going to lack counterplay and they're just going to feel too good. They're going to be too common in your matches, and they're going to end up replicating too common of play patterns, which is what we're seeing right now in Guilty Gear Strive. I actually have an entire video talking about how Wild Salt is doing just that. But with nerfs, you can try to dial some of those things back. You can force characters to have to look into different play patterns. You can dial back some of the things that make characters frustrating. However, the issue with nerfing, and it is what people most bring up when they talk about nerfing in fighting games, is that you also run the risk of making the game less fun. And I think the most accurate kind of representation of this for me is actually Granblue Fantasy Versus. When that game came out, you know, Granblue was supposed to be kind of a more basic, simple game. But when that game came out, it had some very powerful tools in it. And over time, especially with Season 2 of Granblue, they ended up nerfing a lot of things, and it kind of alienated a lot of the player base because they took out what they thought was fun about their characters. So when it comes to balancing, I think that there's a lot of different nuances to it. And the first one is just the fact that when you're balancing a game, you also have to take into consideration whether it's fun or not. So I think when it comes to patches in fighting games, there's actually two types of patches. And I feel like it's something that people don't talk about when they talk about patching a fighting game, which is that in my mind there are balance patches, which are meant to just do as they say, which is balance the game out, right? Bring the top tiers down a little bit, bring the low tiers up a little bit, that type of thing. It's about condensing character strength and making sure characters are more equal with each other. But then there's also the patches that are meant to introduce more fun into the game. For me, these are usually like your seasonal patches. So for Guilty Gear, it's usually your season 2 patch, your season 3 patch, that type of thing. These are kind of like your yearly patches, or maybe, you know, every 6 months type of patch. And these patches aren't really made with the intention of balance in mind. I'd argue most of the time they end up making the balance worse in the game for the time being. They're supposed to make the game more fun and exciting by just introducing new things for characters to do. And I think there's a place for both types of patches, and I think it's important for developers and players both to recognize what type of patch they're even trying to make in the first place. And even when it comes to making a patch for fun and trying to address the fun of a game, I think it's important to note that sometimes nerfing can make a game more fun as well, because if you nerf things that are frustrating about the game, it also gives you the opportunity to introduce new things for those characters to do. I think the reason why nerfing kind of gets a bad rep is that very often developers go about it, I think, the wrong way, where they just nerf a character and they don't do anything else with them. Taking a very recent example, we have Zato in Guilty Gear, where in Season 3, he is probably the most nerfed character, and Zato players just don't like playing him anymore. He's just not fun to play. The character is almost entirely irrelevant in competitive play at this point. They just went too far. You know, they didn't do anything for him. They didn't really give him anything new to play with. He hasn't gotten his new special move yet, for example. So currently, he's just objectively worse and objectively less fun to play. And that's an example of over-nerfing a character and not actually addressing the character the right way. Was Zato a character that probably should have been changed and a character that is frustrating to fight? Yeah, he is. He probably should have been adjusted. But if you're going to nerf a character, you have to make sure to either not go overboard, or if you are nerfing integral parts of the character's kit, you need to introduce new elements for them to be able to use and for players to be able to explore. And then on the flip side, if you're going to buff characters, you also need to make sure you're not going too far, because you're going back to what I was saying earlier, where you're going to lose the original identity of the character, and the character is no longer going to have key weaknesses that they're supposed to have. Or their tools are going to end up so strong that they just feel overbearing to fight against, and there isn't going to be counterplay towards them. So for example, I think a character that is kind of a good example of this is actually Sin in Strive right now with Season 3. So in Season 2, Sin was not a good character. He was not very represented or anything. And in Season 3, they gave him the hookup. He is probably the most buff character in Season 3, and I think that's technically fine. But I do think that the character, while he isn't the best character in the game or anything, there are things about him that probably should have been scaled down to compensate for the fact that they buffed him so much. Namely, the thing that comes to mind for Sin is he probably should not be able to do DP into Kara RTL, because that just is way too rewarding of a defensive option, and regardless if you're a strong character or a weak character, something like that probably just shouldn't exist in the game. So yeah, I think this topic is like pretty nuanced in terms of whether buffing is good or whether nerfing is good, and I think the answer to the question is just, it depends. I don't think there's any right answer to it. I think if you're just buffing, you're going to run into issues. If you're just nerfing, you're going to run into issues. And even when buffing or nerfing is correct, I think there's a proper way to go about it that is often missed. And again, I think the reason it's often missed is because balancing a fighting game is very hard, because there's so much you have to take into consideration. You have to take into consideration the literal balance of the characters. You have to take into consideration, are they fun to play or not? Are they fun to fight against or not? How do these characters operate at different skill levels? Because that's another thing that developers have to think about, you know? Oftentimes we'll see characters nerfed that aren't even like considered strong characters in high level play, and that's because the character is considered problematic at like lower levels of play. And that is something that matters, because frankly, more fighting game players are in the low to mid level skill levels compared to high level or top level play. So there's so many different things that developers have to factor into, and I do think it is important to give them credit and recognize that balancing a fighting game is very difficult. Those are just my thoughts on the topic. Of course, I do want to know what you all on YouTube think about this as well. Do you think it's better to buff or nerf? Do you think that there are some good or bad examples of how to do balancing? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subbing to the channel. It would really help me out, and I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.